Hey, all you Ethicuties and the 40% of you who have still not subscribed to the Ethicsverse, welcome to the coolest place to be every Thursday at noon Eastern. If you think fixing our workplace can fix our world, I got a real treat for you today. We have the one and only Matt Kelly, fan favorite, best moderator in the game. And we're talking about setting the scope for investigations. So as we get started here, drop your LinkedIn URL in the chat. You know I say this every week because I mean it. Your network is your net worth. Neither are big enough. So drop that in the chat. And drop in how many inches of snow you got in the last week. We got about a foot here in North Carolina, which was the snow apocalypse of 2026. My wife is going a little crazy because my kids have been, with the holidays and all the snowstorms, they've been at home, locked in the house for the last 2 weeks. So I'm going home to that this evening. All right. We are giving out credits, of course, for HRCI, CCB, and for SHRM. So if you're here to get some credits, you're in the place to be. And if you're here to get some books, this is also the place to be. Readers are leaders. My mom said it growing up, and boy, was she right. So we love giving away books here. We are featuring this week, we are featuring Hema and Ashley's new trilogy. So they've now completed the trilogy, and this is all about the art of ideation. How do you drive better cultural engagement? How do you drive better implementation of your ideas? So these are available on Kindle, of course. I think that bargain is still going on. If you don't want to win one. If you're not feeling lucky, go ahead and go and pick that up on Amazon. But we're going to be giving away 5 of those today. And I'm still talking about the year in review. We put out more content last year than ever. Ethico has gotten famous in our space. We've gotten compliance famous for all the resources that we put out and all the content that we put out. So if you have not yet checked out the year in review, I tell you to go and check it out. If you have checked it out, you didn't check it out enough. So go back to check out the year in review. There should be a link on the console. And see if there's some stuff that you can grab from that you can use to improve your program. Speaking of improving our program, we're improving our software every single week, every single month, with sprints coming out all the time. And so MySim is now better than ever. We've incorporated some new ways to report, new ways to drive better analytics and better workflow assignments. So much of our job, it's not like we don't have things to do. The list never gets done. The reports continue to come in. So our job is really to make better bets with our time. And when we can use automations, when we can use, software workflows to cut out some of those manual steps, we can spend more of our time putting our unique gifts to work. And that's what the name of the game is in 2026. So if you have not checked it out, I would encourage you to do it. And you're going to love it. Okay. I want to talk a little bit about Scott. Scott, how's it going? Tell us a little bit about white collar forensics.
Well, thanks for having me today, Nick. So White Collar Forensic is my firm. After 26 years in the private sector, after my government career, helping companies, manage complex investigations and, kind of the internal controls and compliance program shortcomings that come to the fore as a result of those internal investigations, I started my own firm. Same thing that I've been doing for 30 years, helping companies and their law firms kind of manage their response to, significant investigations, getting them to the other side, pursue avenues for recovery, and then, fixing the things that were described or exposed as broken along the way.
Well, we are so happy to have you here on the Ethicsverse, especially for this topic. You are an absolute expert in it. Before we dive in, though, and I pass the mic over to the one and only Matt Kelly, I want to tell you guys to go to Radical Compliance. I don't know why you're not signed up yet for the Radical Compliance newsletter and why this is not your homepage. So go to radicalcompliance.com. On the right side, you're going to see a place to sign up and subscribe. This is not spam, okay? Matt will never spam you. But if you're not following Matt on LinkedIn, you're not following Radical Compliance every single day, checking out all this new content that's putting out, you're not showing up as smart as you could. So definitely go ahead and do that. We're up to 1,000 emojis just through the announcement. So I got a really good feeling about today's episode. We're going to leave you with some great tips and frameworks to start applying this afternoon. So I'm going to pass it on over to you, Matt. The coolest guy in compliance. One more round of applause for Matt Kelly.
Thank you very much, Nick. And hello, everybody who is joining us today. It's great to have you here. So our topic here today is we're really getting down to like nuts and bolts issues of a good, effective compliance team, talking about how to scope an investigation properly and then make sure that you keep that scope on track as your investigation unfolds and your issue might go hither and yon. maybe the thing is going to turn out to be worse than you thought. You have to change the scope. Maybe it's going to turn out to be nothing. You can shrink down the scope. But how do you determine that at the start? How do you deal with others who might be involved in the investigation? And what are the best practices here, even before you get into, do I interview this person? Do I look at that data? What if it's an allegation? What if it's the result of an audit, or it's something that just feels iffy to you, as opposed to a very precise thing? There's a lot of different ways that, your investigation could go off the rails, which could have really bad consequences down the road. So we want to get to that. All right. So our speakers, in addition to Scott, who has lots of experience on the consulting side and is ex-FBI and has done many investigations over the years, Jane Kleiner, who is Director of Global Compliance Investigations at Bristol Myers Squibb and comes from a big corporate side and from that perspective of how this might really work at a real corporation. Jane, welcome. Thank you for joining us here today, too.
Thanks so much. And just the usual disclaimer that all views expressed will be my own and not that of the company I work for. Glad to be
Let's
here.
get a round of applause for that compliant announcement at the start here. Very good.
Gotta check that box.
And I suppose before we go any further, I should announce that here in Boston, we got 2.5 feet of snow, and it's been about 18 degrees for 3 weeks. But we are going to the Super Bowl in 2 days, so everything's fine. All right. And for anybody listening, as always, we want to make this as useful a discussion for you all as possible. If you have questions or comments or thoughts about our discussion today, by all means, pop those into the attendee chat. In theory, we'll set aside a devoted time at the end for Q&A, but if you have a good question and you ask it right away, I'll try and slip it in to Scott and Jane as soon as possible. And we want to make this as interactive and useful for you as we can. All of that said, let's get into it. I guess my first question, I will pose this probably first to Scott and then Jane and then Nick, if you have thoughts as well. But what do we even mean by scoping the investigation correctly? What does that entail and why are we talking about it? Scott, how would you answer that first?
I think, listen, we were talking about this before we kicked off. It's seldom talked about, but it's so important. It's what is the information that we have at the outset, and then how can we structure the investigation in an optimal way so that we can then evaluate whether or not the suspicions or the allegations at hand can be corroborated. You don't ever want to embark on a kind of a canned investigative approach. You have to kind of go with something that is tailored to what you have in hand, if the information in hand even lends itself to investigative steps. Sometimes the allegations that you have are so vague, there isn't a logical starting point, and the best course of action is actually try to go back to the source of that information to try to get something more tangible that then will enable you to create the scope.
Mm-hmm. Jane, give us your thoughts here too. And I guess one question I have right away is, would you say that this is the same as triaging an investigation or triaging an allegation, or is there a difference, or what would you say what are we talking about here?
Yeah, that's a great question, and I do agree with everything Scott said. To me, scoping an investigation correctly boils down to determining the purpose of the investigation and determining a plan of action, with a plan of action including getting a real understanding of what background information do we need, what's the structure of the team that's implicated in the wrongdoing, and that's partly to understand who to interview, but also, and especially if this is an ex-US investigation, are there cultural elements that we need to be aware of and better understand before we dive in and start talking to real humans? What business pressures is the team facing? Are there goals? Are there deadlines? Are there readouts we need to be aware of? What's the climate on the team? What background materials, kind of like what Scott said, emails, other communications, business records need to be reviewed. All of this to me is part of the scoping, part of the understanding of what we're working with here and determining that plan of action, because some investigations are intended to simply establish facts and pass them on to others, almost like internal fact finding and in preparation maybe for a change for the business or maybe in anticipation of litigation. I'm thinking of climate assessments that are often done by employee relations professionals. But other investigations are performed because someone has alleged wrongdoing or misconduct. And the purpose of those investigations is usually to determine whether the allegations are true. And so for me, as an attorney working in a compliance organization, I'm often looking at allegations of wrongdoing by employees that are triggering either legal, regulatory, and of course, ethical concerns. And I need to understand sort of what contexts and framework we're operating in before we can effectively dive in.
All right. Nick, any other thoughts here about the importance of getting this right, or just the overall need to be able to do this well?
From the Ethico perspective, we see over 500,000 reports per year across our platform. And it seems like the ones that go sideways, the ones that have, that age out too long or that, can't get closed. I think it always kind of comes down to the scoping discussion. Scoping is really just kind of determining, it's kind of a purpose statement, right? Like, what are we looking for? Who needs to be involved? And, what does done look like? Just to kind of echo what's been said so far. And so I think when the scope is too narrow or the scope is too broad, it kind of can turn into, a bunch of wasted cycles. And so I think the biggest maybe misconception about scoping is that it's not a one size fits all thing, and it's not a one-time decision. It should really kind of serve as this sort of like living thesis as more evidence comes out. The scope, may change, but it should always be this sort of North Star, this compass that we use to make sure that we're, anchored in the right spot and driving toward the right outcome.
Okay, I really like the way that you described it, Nick, just now, as a living thesis of where we're trying to go, because that kind of leads into the next question I was going to ask to set the table here was, well, how hard can this be? You have an allegation, so-and-so is committing fraud, so we're going to look at so-and-so and whether or not there's fraud. But I do assume it's a lot harder to scope than my oversimplistic idea. And, to Nick's point there, that this is a living thesis, and what we think is the scope today, we might find out 4 weeks from now we were way wrong. This is better, worse, different, something, and we have to change the status or the scope of it. But I'll go in the same order, Scott, and then Jane, and then Nick. Like, tell me more about, I don't know, why is this so hard, or examples of how you've seen it go wrong and you kind of wince at what the client has been doing later on or something like that. But okay, how hard can this be? Scott, tell me how hard it can be.
It can be hard. You used a word earlier, which is, it's a word that I use often, which is triage. I think triage it's a good mindset, because you look at what you have, and often an investigation, takes, it gets compartmentalized in phases. And that first phase is, can we corroborate some or all of what was alleged at the outset? And that kind of then gets you to an inflection point. Half the time or more, the allegations aren't credible. And, then you're in this situation where you probably need to be pencils down, but you need to kind of document the process that you did follow, and whatever, sort of enabled you to come to that conclusion in a way that's, if somebody comes in cold later on, they can, look at it objectively and say, okay, yeah, this was reasonable. And it's a reasonable conclusion that they came to. But those that get you to that inflection point, and you've corroborated some or all of what has been alleged, then you have to step back and say, all right, now we need to expand the scope. And we probably need to involve other people. If outside counsel wasn't already involved, maybe that's a good time to sort of tap them on the shoulder. Are there regulatory agencies that need to be notified? If you're a publicly traded company, you always have to look to the auditing firm, because they have their own obligations. And, it's been my experience, and those of a lot of people's experience that have done these types of investigations, the audit firm has a lot of input and is allowed to have a lot of input on the scope. and you want to make sure that you don't get too far down the road without eliciting their input.
Jane, give me your thoughts here too. We already have a lot of user comments coming in fast and furious. In fact, somebody who was just talking about audit firms and saying if it's something that arises from an audit, it has a very clear scope, or it has a clear objective. That's the way audits work, but that's not the same as if an allegation comes in or you're just looking at your own data analysis, something weird seems there. But Jane, tell me a little bit more about how you, I don't know, struggle to get started here or try and figure out which end is up, and how do you get going?
Right. Well, I agree that there comes an inflection point, and then you have to decide, have you found any of the allegations credible? And then you kind of decide whether you go on from there. In terms of how you get going, how you reach that point in the first place, I mean, the often the best source of information initially is the reporter, right? And so if the reporter is anonymous, it can be complicated because they would like to dump and run. Here's a complaint, I never want to touch this again. You folks figure out what the issues are. So I think a best practice is to try to engage that person and protect their anonymity in one of a variety of ways, right? You can have a confidential conversation where they're dialing into a phone line and you can't see them. You can use certain special technology to even block their voice if necessary, or change their voice. But to really engage with that person and get whatever materials or information that they have to sort of make sure that you understand what the allegation is. And so I think that's how you get started, right? And then to the point made earlier, as you go along, you may have to change the scope that you thought was under review, and that's okay, right? If things sort of wrap up early, lucky you can memorialize what you found and move on. But if the allegations seem to be credible, you have to figure out who else needs to be involved. Those may be outside resources, but those may be subject matter experts within your company or organization who can speak to, is this seemingly alarming thing actually concerning? Why is that the case? If not, why is that the case? And what other potential risks does this raise? And that's where you have to be careful, because you don't want to go on a wild goose chase. You don't want to continue the investigation forever. You're not necessarily looking under every rock to find all possible problems. So you have to sort of know where what's in range, essentially, and what's not. And that I think can be the challenging point.
Here's a good question. And Nick, maybe I'll let you opine on this first and then circle back to Scott and Jane afterwards. But somebody who is writing in that, where did they say it? How do you right size the scope based on risk so that minor issues don't become over-engineered, fair point, while high-risk cases get the depth they deserve, which everybody understands? And I'm kind of stuck on that because I don't quite know what a low-risk thing would be other than money. If it's somebody's raiding $20 from petty cash, I get it that you don't want to open a federal case over that, but I don't know if there's such a thing as like a low ethical concern, or if a low-level person does an unethical thing, that's not a big deal, but if a senior one does, so I'm trying to figure out, how do you set the scope to match the risk involved other than money? I'm not quite sure what the criteria is. Nick, I don't know if you have any thoughts, but then Scott and Jane.
Yeah, I mean, it's a good question. And I think, Jane kind of touched on it a little bit, a minute ago, where if this can be more of a living, breathing thing, or you have in your mindset an ability to kind of pivot, then I think you can double click or look under more rocks if more risk comes up. Part of the challenge with this whole scoping discussion, though, is there's sort of inherently sometimes the assumption that the reporter fully understands the problem. When in actuality, the reporters are kind of describing symptoms, and it's on us as the doctors to come up with a diagnosis, So, and I think it also kind of assumes that there's, kind of like a one-to-one relationship between the allegation and reality. And so if we assume that, the odds of overscoping are usually a lot higher. So if we can kind of step into an investigation with a little bit more of a kind of fluidity or a little bit more flexibility with an initial hypothesis, as we were talking about before, and then looking for that sort of confirmatory evidence to see, is this a pervasive problem? Is this a one-off? What else might this be a symptom of? I think it can, because like the basis of that question is, how do I make sure I'm applying the right size scope to the right size problem? And like, what are some early indicators that, of risk that can help me kind of widen the aperture on the scope? So I would just say that like letting the reporter set the scope is not the answer. Just looking at that initial allegation as sort of a starting point of something that's going on, and recognizing that sometimes you pull a thread and it's really connected to a web and it's part of a much, broader issue, that can help, in, not misapplying a scope, I think. That wasn't really that good of an answer, though, now that I think back on what I just said.
Well, it was a good enough answer. Yes, it was. But Scott, give me your thoughts on this, and especially to Nick's point that a lot of times the reporter is going to give you an incident and they don't really know exactly what's going on either. They might have a fragment. They might have a risk. And,
right.
Your job is to try and figure out this is a big risk, so it deserves all our attention. I'm still stuck on if it's not a financial issue, like what are the other criteria to say it's a low risk? I'm not quite sure, but Scott, what would you say? And then Jane.
It's, I think it's like the definition of pornography. You know it when you see it. It's difficult though. I think sometimes it's difficult to kind of get people to move past what if there's an economic component to it. Is it worth our time and effort to commit resources to investigate a theft of $25,000 but often those numbers are preliminary and they're wrong. I think it really goes to more of, this is a breach. Somebody has departed significantly from where the guardrails are, and we have to give this a thorough look. Yes, there are times where the allegations and then the steps that are taken to try to determine whether they have merit, kind of leads you to a conclusion that we don't need to go any further, given the relative insignificance of what was alleged and then what we were able to find. But a lot of times, that initial information is completely driven by somebody who has maybe just a sliver of information, right, and they don't see the whole picture. So yep. I think you just have to look at the logical sources of information that are going to tell you not only do these allegations have merit, but are we off in terms of the scale and severity and the potential consequences down the road.
Jane, what do you think about all this, and how do you try and figure these things out when you're starting with incomplete material? You might not know how big of a risk it is.
Yeah. What I would add to the discussion that we've had so far is that, and I think this is maybe more possible in larger organizations, but to the extent that you can leverage different investigatory functions or groups, it can be really helpful to prioritize who starts with a matter, but then ensure ongoing communication with the different investigating groups. So as an example, something may start out, and frankly often does, as an employee relations matter. Two employees are disagreeing over either strategy or just not getting along, right? It's maybe a seemingly a he said, she said situation. And perhaps an employee relations or human resources investigator is the person who starts with that matter. But as they get into it, perhaps they stumble across an allegation that there is some law that potentially is being broken, or some kind of regulatory misconduct going on, depending on the industry that you're in. And there you may need to bring in an SMO, an expert who can speak to whether, in fact, the conduct violates regulation, whether, in fact, this is becoming something more akin to something that a government body would want to look into, and the nature of the investigation needs to change and become, let's say, privileged. So I think communication between groups like corporate security, compliance, employee relations, to sort of hand off appropriate parts of an investigation can help with scope, because the relevant investigator has a real understanding of sort of what the universe of problems looks like and what the risk leveling is. And if there's something outside their wheelhouse and they can partner with a colleague who, whose work is maybe driven or focused on something else, I think that can really help to get to the part where you're figuring out, is this a big deal? Do I need more resources for this? Or is this actually not such a complex matter?
Well,
which kind of underscores the importance of not having siloed investigations, to your point, because somebody might have a different vantage point or a different sort of, perspective that somebody who's maybe more front lines or more sort of myopically viewed on one sort of aspect of the employee experience might not even be on their radar, to your point.
That leads right into my next question, was whether if you get an allegation, your natural instinct would be to start talking to other colleagues about, well, what do you think? Where should we go with this? And I wasn't sure if that is appropriate or not, or when it might not be. One of the commenters there earlier said that we always scope an investigation in conjunction with HR. They're like joined at the hip. A couple of other people who said, as always, legal gets into it right away because legal wants to be in everything and exercise privilege. And so I see the sense in having other eyes on the problem, but I also am not sure if having too many cooks in the kitchen suddenly gets unwieldy, and how you would navigate that. Scott, what have you seen when you're dealing with clients and through your career about like how many people should be involved in that start, and where can that get messy and where is it wise?
So it's, you raise a lot of important issues. It's definitely a proceed with caution situation for a variety of reasons. Listen at that, to the extent that the allegations speak to things that are ongoing, people are still in their roles and in a position to do harm. There's a phase at the outset of an investigation is, let's do that which we can do below the radar and gather information, so then we can make informed decisions as to next steps. How are we engage with whom? Do we need to maybe remove people from their roles, either by suspending them or cutting off their access, et cetera? So whenever you start widening the circle of trust, to quote Robert De Niro, you run the risk of it getting back to the very people that you're looking at. So you have to be thoughtful. I mean, there are times where, and I think Jane touched upon this a moment ago, where you need to get some industry expertise because it's relevant and unfamiliar. And that, should be, part of the calculus in terms of, how do we approach this? But then, of course, the other issue that you raise, it's that of waiver of privilege. And you want to make sure that nothing that you do widens the net to the point where you have now inadvertently waived the attorney-client privilege, which a bell that can't be unrung.
Jane, give me your thoughts here as well, just a little bit more about how you figure it out, or how often does it come up maybe that you don't necessarily want to involve a lot of people because you're not quite sure where this will go and it might get very messy. Like, how do you balance that?
Yeah, I think the trick is to involve people on an as-needed basis. And if you don't need to show them the language of the complaint or tell them which individuals you're interviewing, or who the reporter is, there's no need to do that, right? You can go to a colleague, let's say in the legal department, and say, I have a concern in X market. It's about Y issue. Generally speaking, right? Don't go into a lot of details. Can you tell me, what you're aware of from your work in that market in terms of business pressures, information about Project X, concerns that the people in the market may have, that kind of thing, and use it as information getting exercise, as opposed to saying, well, what do you think about this allegation? Do you think this is
Totally,
accurate? Should I substantiate? Right? They're there to inform you and give you the context that you need to move forward, right? And I think that there may come a point later in the investigation where you have to divulge more about what you've learned. But I would err on the side of caution, particularly at the outset, so that you're not risking waiving privilege if that's a concern, or so that you're not, sharing information that's meant to be kept confidential beyond the scope, no pun intended, of the folks who really need to know.
Sometimes when people come on a show, they don't want to disagree with the host. So that's not how it is here. This is an idea meritocracy. So I'm going to throw something out here and like your honest kind of response to it. But kind of to your point, I think we should have a pretty high bar for getting more people involved in an investigation. We should have, confidence in our own sort of investigative agency to know when we add someone to it. And so kind of a good proxy or whatever for that kind of high bar is the kind of large pizza, the large pizza test. You shouldn't have more people in the investigation in most cases to where a large pizza wouldn't feed them. And I think if you can keep that kind of a mentality or that kind of a high watermark, then you're going to, you're not, it's going to prevent you from going to that legal resource and saying, hey, what do you think about this allegation? It's going to, it's going to cause you to keep more of that, the number of parties that are eating off the pizza a little bit lower. What do you think about that? A lot of people in the chat agree. No pressure though.
Scott, what do you think of the large pizza test?
All I can think of is that, if my son were a part of the team, he'd eat the whole pizza, and then it would be a very small team.
Okay. Well, he might be a one-man show,
But yeah, I agree. I think, listen, I think a lot of it goes to the forethought of having an investigative protocol and plan that then you carry forward, understanding the resources that are available to you inside the organization, the extent to which there are skill sets outside of the organization that you may need to call upon, and having them available to you, because, sometimes I meet organizations and it's the very first time they're going down this road. Other times I talk to organizations, they do 500 or 1,000 of these a year, very different approaches, because there's this cadence. When you have something that you do quite often, where the information sources are, who you can involve when you need to, and you can kind of turn, you can pull these different levers because the inner workings of the organization and the capabilities that you have. So I think that, I think a lot of it starts with, you have a plan, you have policies, you have knowledge in terms of information that becomes important early on or at different stages, because that then makes the process much more efficient.
Jane, do you want to weigh in on the large pizza barometer?
Every case is a fact-specific inquiry, right? And sometimes you only need a couple people to eat the pizza, and sometimes you need a few more, right? But maybe those few more get nibbles at the pizza, right? They don't need an entire slice or several slices.
Yeah, they just eat the crust,
For example, right? So I think one has to be careful, right? Obtain information and context without oversharing details, because you tell one person, they tell another person, and on. And suddenly the confidential nature of the discussion is broken or lost. And, all of the potential witnesses relevant to a specific investigation have been put on notice that they're about to be questioned, right? And they start aligning their stories or so on. You don't want that, right? And so I like the idea of not oversharing the pizza.
Here's a good question from a listener that I'll just put to people right away. And Scott, you have a lot of experience here. Maybe I'll put this to you first. So far, we have been assuming that we here, the company, we have found this incident, this allegation, this audit, whatever, and we're investigating. But the listener is writing, if some external regulator comes to you and says, this is the issue that we have found, we're going to get all up in your face, and now you're investigating based on what they've served you, do you want to stick with what they've told you, or do you want to keep an open mind about the scope of the investigation in case they've only got 4 slices of the pizza, but now there's actually a lot more we haven't told you? Like, how do you just do what you're told versus we're going to take what the regulators gave us and we're going to run with it wherever it may take us? Scott, how do you answer that question?
Well, I don't think you'll ever get somebody to answer that question the same way, right? It's because there's 2 schools of thought. The one that I've been schooled on with working with outside counsel is go with what they're telling you, right? Can set your investigation based on the information provided. Don't open up Pandora's box unnecessarily and start looking in different parts of the company, in different business units, at different conduct that they didn't bring to your attention, because then you're just potentially amplifying their level of interest in your organization. So at least initially, go with the information that they've provided to you, unless, of course, there's something already that you're aware of and that the two things align, because then you have to sort of bring them together. But usually if they're at the point where they're engaging with you, there's a lot that they know already that they haven't shared with you, and they want to know what you come back to them with. But it's a very deliberate act what they're doing. The information they shared is very deliberate, and a lot of thought went into it. So let that guide you.
That's interesting, because I'm stuck on the situation that if the regulator says, well, we found X, and so you're staring at X, and I'm going to pretend I'm not seeing Y in the corner of my eye that they'd probably want to know about. But if it ever came out in later on that we also then discovered this other thing was happening, but we didn't disclose it because that's not what you asked about, I could see prosecutors perhaps flipping out over that. Am I right? Am I wrong? What do you think, Scott?
Yeah. Listen, I think that's a slightly different scenario, right? If this is news to you, right, go with what they told you. If there's already something kind of, or some things bubbling to the surface, and this aligns with part of it, but there's other things also, I think it really comes down to what do you know at the time, and then what did you learn upon looking at what they brought to your attention? Because, I think, if anything we're learning from this discussion is investigations don't follow a straight line.
Right.
They're iterative, and the output from your investigation might look very different than what you expected to receive.
Okay. Jane, what are your thoughts on this issue here?
It's a tricky one, fraught with all kinds of legal concerns. And I think if you ever have a situation where a regulator comes knocking and purports to have certain information about your enterprise and wants either your corroboration, your cooperation, a disclosure, especially if you're a business person or if you're not legal, you need to get with legal real fast. And legal may contact, or likely will contact outside legal. And there needs to be an internal discussion with the relevant stakeholders and decision makers, and an approach needs to be considered. And that approach is likely to be different depending on what the allegations are and what the supposed findings are. But to me, that's a go to legal hard stop kind of situation, and take it from there.
All right. Nick, any other thoughts on this delicate minefield?
Yeah, I think Jane is right. Go to legal. Every organization is like a little bit different from a risk appetite perspective and how they want to sort of like apply gamesmanship to these kinds of things. I think you and I, Matt, have been on enough conversations with like former DOJ folks, like on the Ethicsverse, where there seems to be kind of a through line, okay, so like that gamesmanship aside, or that sort of like legal strategy stuff aside, the thing that I remember hearing over and over again in those multiple different episodes was that, applying a good faith response to it is usually probably like your best bet. Mm-hmm. So I'm not saying look under every single rock and come back and show them, every single thing, but treating that as, a regular allegation that you're going to put a good faith, investigative, wood behind that arrow, I think is probably the best bet. But don't take that advice. Obviously, go to legal first.
Bunch of different people here who are always saying involve legal immediately if that's the scenario. But if you discover more in your exploration, always disclose that because they always know more than they're telling you. Fair point. I love this scenario because it does get to that situation where maybe it would be legal just to do what you're told, but is that always going to be the ethical thing if you find something else that, okay, they didn't ask about it, I guess I don't have to tell them? That I'm not sure that passes the ethical smell test, and that's kind of why I love that question from the audience member. As a practical matter, if you scope an investigation, you find it's quite serious, you hand it off to outside counsel, what would you typically want to do then? And how would you either keep an eye on it from afar, or do you just wrap it up in a bow to outside counsel and say, send us the progress memo at the end of the quarter? Scott, what would you say about that? And then Jane, what would you say?
Listen, sometimes the company has to take a step back. And because of the seriousness of the allegations, because of maybe the seniority of the people that are in the crosshairs, the company, needs to really kind of turn over the keys to outside counsel, as comfortable and uncomfortable as that may be. But as often, it's a collaboration where the company is working with outside counsel and maybe other service providers to kind of get, answers and to make sure that it isn't uncomfortable. There needs to be an upfront discussion in terms of who's doing what, and roles and responsibilities, and also kind of the cadence of communication. I think a lot of discomfort or power struggles emanate from poor communications. They're not talking often enough. They're not talking about the right things. They're not really kind of getting into the specifics of who's going to do what and when. I think if you have all of that conversation up front, you're much more likely to kind of bond as you come together as a team. And that's, but there has to be a free flow of communication at the front end in order to really have success as a team going forward.
Jane, actually, in the interest of time, Jane, I'm going to ask you a follow-up question based on what Scott was saying. I agree with this point that it's productive to have that discussion up front. That, I guess, leads me to another question of how important is it to develop clear, written investigation protocols so we all know how we're going to interact with outside counsel. We all know who's going to get pulled in at what time on a hypothetical, instead of just trying to figure it out in the actual furnace of a real matter. Like, how important is it to develop and document a strong investigative infrastructure?
I think it depends. I hate that answer, but it's the right answer here. Because it really depends on the nature of the allegations, the number of people that are involved, the amount of latitude you're giving to outside counsel, and communication cadence aside, the frequency of the, not just the frequency of the touch points that you're having with them, but the amount of control you plan to exert over their work. And so I think in this situation of involving outside counsel, you don't want to be so prescriptive in telling them how to do their jobs that it does not give them the latitude to do things that, that they need to do, right? You don't want them running back to you and saying, oh, can we essentially it's can we change the scope of work? Like, you don't want that interrupting the flow of their work every time. And so I think that you have to sort of establish and have a level of trust when you're retaining outside counsel, and hopefully it's going to be an ongoing collaboration, because the company likely doesn't want outside counsel going, for example, directly to witnesses who are employees or even former employees, without involvement of someone on the inside to sort of make the introductions and reassure the employee that it's okay to participate and give information, right? In-house attorneys are going to be, or compliance folks are going to be, helping access the necessary materials and answering questions about organizational structure and where files are stored. And so there's no way to entirely and completely hand things off and just say, okay, call me at the end, right? You wouldn't want that, because it would be inefficient, and because the ongoing dialogue, I think, is what's necessary to a thorough and complete investigation. So, yeah.
Nick, give me some of your thoughts here, because I'm seeing a lot of discussion from attendees who are saying it's important to have some guardrails, but they also have to be flexible guardrails. And like to Jane's point, I don't know that there's a clear answer here, but I'm trying to figure out what the basics are. What would you say?
Well, I mean, any document that's going to document a hypothetical, investigation is really just trying to articulate some algorithm in your mind, right? And so I think in general, whether it's an internal investigation or you're involving outside counsel, to the extent that you can put some principles on paper that are not going to articulate every single scenario, because that's going to be ridiculous and it's going to be overly rigid and it's not going to account for, every investigation. Put some principles on paper that can be a good sort of start or a good foundation for, what those guardrails, those flexible guardrails are going to be. And I think in particular with the case of outside counsel, I know everyone's a lawyer and lawyers are, the best, but there is a perverse incentive, right? There is a perverse incentive anytime there's an outside party who's providing services to your organization. There's an incentive for them to bill that as much as possible. And again, I know the arguments for long-term relationship and, the ethics of lawyers, wink, wink. But I think having some guardrails in place that say, if the scope is going to change significantly, or the scope, I want to review the scope that you come up with, and putting some of those touch points. To Jane's point, you don't need to be involved in everything, but you want to have some kind of an oversight. That can do a lot, I think, to get the ultimate sort of scoping dialed in on a kind of recurring basis.
Let me ask another question here. Scott, I'll start with you. Originally, I was going to say, what happens if you find out 6 weeks, 6 months later, you scoped it wrong? I'm not sure I want to phrase it like that, but if you are investigating and you have now found out this is worse than we thought, what are the implications there? You might have to go back to people who you originally told them, I don't think this is a big deal. It's a big deal. I didn't think you were going to be in the frame of this mess. You're in the frame of this mess. But how do you document that you decided to change the scope? How much more complicated or tense can it get if it's getting worse? And my next question will be, what happens when you find out it's a nothing burger? But for now, you found out we were wrong. This is worse. What is that like?
Yeah, listen, I think you have to go into every investigation with the expectation that your the scope's probably going to have to change at some point. It's a rare investigation that just never deviates from the scope that you set at the outset with limited information. It's inherently an iterative process. But yeah, I mean, sometimes if it, it doesn't seem like a serious matter, and then it becomes, existential, right? And potentially, puts the company at risk, or certainly, maybe key people at risk. You have to, you got to own it, and it has to be, there has to be a discussion and say, hey, this is now very different. New information has come to light. Some of what we, set as part of the scope is become far less important. And then there are some things that, weren't at all a part of the scope that now are front and center. And in terms of somebody, maybe being on the sidelines, and now it's very much looking like, it's their business unit or them specifically in the center of it. I think it's, you got to be thoughtful about prematurely making those disclosures, but there does come a point where the investigation gets to the admission-seeking interview phase, where we spoke to you earlier, you were helpful to us. We've learned a lot more now, and we need to have a different conversation with you now because things have changed significantly, and we want to give you the opportunity to really kind of, share additional information, or maybe even set the record straight. And those are difficult conversations, but I think it's just key is you want to be thoughtful about the timing of when you have those conversations.
Jane, what's your advice on how to handle these issues if you find the scope or the subject is worse than we thought? We're going to have to take it up a level. What's your experience, or what's your advice on how people should keep that in mind and handle it?
Yeah, so I think what's important to keep in mind is not to make promises to witnesses or business folks that you don't know that you will be able to keep. So don't tell a witness that they're definitely not a subject and that that they're not in trouble if you don't know if that's going to change, right? Because to the extent that that changes later, you will have lost credibility with your witness, your interviewee, and they're going to be that much less forthcoming. So I advise against making those types of promises. I advise against telling witnesses or even the business, this is a really minor thing at the outset, because as we just said,
right,
that could change. And if you're doing a preliminary readout because something seems sensitive and the business wants periodic updates, make sure you disclose and disclaim, like, this is a preliminary readout. This is where we are now, but this is subject to change. I just want to add that, if we sort of widen our aperture and think about ex-US, right, there are countries where there is an obligation to tell witnesses up front if they are the subject. And so there have been times I've experienced this where someone was not a subject initially, but things changed as new information came to light. And as Scott said, I think the best way to handle that is to be as transparent as possible and to say, we've received new information. And so, as you know, we've now scheduled this additional conversation with you. We are now going to talk to you about, additional topics, themes, et cetera. And, we have to put you on notice that now that this new information has come to light, we are treating this a little bit differently, or very differently, depending, and let them know, because the last thing you want to do is have that interview with the person who was previously a witness but is now a subject be questioned in terms of its usability, its dependability, because the person was not on appropriate notice.
Yeah. Nick, do you have any other thoughts here about how to handle these? Really, you wind up playing the heavy and breaking potentially bad news to people and upsetting a lot of apple carts. Any other observations?
It just kind of is what it is. It's just kind of the nature of projects like this, where you don't know how you're going to get to that North Star, right? Like, to the extent that the scope that you initially sort of jot down in pencil is about, like, what's good enough and what are we trying to solve for? If that's the destination that we're trying to run at, we might think we're going to go on a very straight path, and then we end up going this really circuitous route. Like, my brother was redoing his bathroom, and he was just going to do tiles, new tiles. And so the scope was a pretty small project, and he ripped the tiles up, and like the floor was rotted out because water had got under there. Well, guess what? That weekend project now turned into a 2-week project. It's just kind of the nature of it. I think if we can go back to a principle that Jane was talking about of, like, not getting out over your skis, not making unqualified statements, being very clear about where we're at and, what is right now, then that gives you a lot of room to, quote unquote, be the heavy. Again, you have to provide the right notice and so forth as somebody moves from witness to subject. But if you're not making promises about the future, if you're just giving a current view of what is and what you know to be true, then I think that allows you at least the opportunity to not have to like backtrack or, not get out over your skis.
And then the last question I want to sneak in, and I'll go to Scott first and then Jane, is the opposite, where you decide, okay, this is a nothing burger. We're going to close this investigation. That strikes me as almost even more perilous, because this might get reviewed 4 years later, or it might come up in a civil lawsuit from somebody who's unhappy, or any number of ways that people are going to be second guessing your decision not to do something. And,
right.
How do you document and quantify that we have decided there's nothing here, we're going to close it? Scott, you first, and then Jane.
Yeah, it is very important to document the negative finding, right? That we have, because, the last thing you want to do is just because, okay, there's nothing here, we don't have to tie this out, because at some point, as you mentioned, someone may come along and say, oh, you just buried this.
Yep.
You had this, horrifying set of allegations, you phoned it in, and there's nothing in the documentation that supports the decision to close without taking any further action. I think that's the key. Unfortunately, that's part of why you need to document, it as thoroughly as you would a more, meaningful investigation, because, it is prone to second guessing. It is an important decision being made, and you have to be able to support the decision making that you made to close by demonstrating the efforts that you undertook to try to get to a point where
right.
You have evidence that's actionable.
All right.
Yeah,
and
leave that trail of breadcrumbs for yourself. Keep those in your case notes as you start to think, oh, I might need to change the scope of this, or I absolutely need to change the scope of this based on this. Like, make it easy for yourself, kind of stack the deck in your favor and leave that trail. I think that's great advice.
Jane, I'll give you maybe a minute or two to give us your thoughts here in this, and then Nick, we can wrap it up for the hour.
Sweet.
Yeah, wonderful. So look, I agree with Scott. You still need to document and memorialize your findings for the record. The fact that the allegations were not substantiated is still a finding, right? That is a finding.
Right. It's still intelligence, right?
You need to explain, as you would have explained why you had a substantiated an allegation. Now you're explaining why you didn't, right? What were the factors, and what was the effort that went into making that decision? The one sort of additional thing that I would add is matters can be reopened, right? And there are times where they may have to be. And if new information comes to light, you essentially amend the record, right? And if the needs of the business require it, if a new complaint with more information or new information comes in, the matter should be reopened and re-examined at the appropriate time. And so I think that sort of having that at the back of your mind, that if things change, we will adjust, should give folks some comfort, right? You do everything you can, or as much as you appropriately can with the information that you have, you reflect and record what you've done. And if there's a change in circumstances, you react accordingly.
All right. So that's all the time we had here, but Jane Kleiner, Scott Moritz, you both gave us a ton of really good stuff. Nick, I'll let you wrap it up and take it home for us.
Thank you all for the participation in the chat. Thank you, Scott and Jane, for joining us today. Matt, of course, highlight of my week anytime you're on. This is a great conversation. And man, I feel like we could write a whole book from the chat and from the transcript of this conversation. So thank you guys so much. Almost 5,000 emojis. I knew it was going to be a home run. A couple of quick announcements. We have 2 Ethicsverse episodes next week. Next on the 12th, next Thursday, we have a bunch of federal prosecutors where we're going to be talking about enforcement, specifically in education, but it's going to be an episode for everybody. So if you want to hear some of that kind of inside baseball, get a little peek behind the curtain, that's going to be a great session on the 12th. So circle your calendar. And then right after we all get out of the doldrums of, Valentine's Day, circle your calendars for that. We have an Ethicsverse healthcare episode on the 17th. the 2026 state of compliance. So hope you guys can join us for that. Hope you found value in this. Tell your friends, tell your neighbors, bring people on your team. The more we can do to fix our mindset, the more we can do to add more tools to our toolbox, the bigger the impact we can have in our organization and on our team. So that's why we show up here every week, sometimes twice a week. So I hope you got some value out of it, and I hope to see you on our next episode. Take care.